Yeah, I'm super excited, everyone. Really great talk so far. I think coolest fig is the new thing I'm going to use everywhere and just annoy everyone about it. Let's acknowledge the elephant in the room. Yes, there are a lot of plants behind me. They are real. I'm going to ask you to bring your focus back to the talk now. But yeah, I'm going to talk about governance in design systems, and I'm going to take it in two parts. First, I'm going to talk you through a little story, and hopefully it's a story that it will resonate with a lot of you and will seem quite familiar if you work in design systems, if you have experience of convincing other people of the great idea that is design systems and the pairing of design systems with Figma. Hopefully you'll be able to empathize, and we'll get into the weeds of governance and some of the various models in that space later on. So I'm going to start with this story, and like I mentioned, it may resonate with some of you already. But once upon a time, in an organization far, far away, there's a ragtag crew of passionate designers that identifies the inconsistencies and other operational problems in the digital products that they ship. And that crew of designers become detectives, and they follow the clues in hopes of uncovering the roots of these problems, even though they've seen the inconsistencies and they've seen in some ways how these have come about. They want to get to the bottom of it, but they already have a hunch, as usually the start of these things would go. The investigation is a success, and they unmask the culprits that have been lurking in dark corners, realizing that the source of all of this are not people. It is something slightly scarier. The culprits are much scarier than people, and our adventurers quickly shine a light on the systemic issues that they uncover. Along the way, they realize that there are inconsistencies everywhere. Collaboration is not easy, as we've seen with some of the examples that Joel mentioned earlier. Components aren't clearly defined, and there are a lot of challenges in the operational side of design in the organization. Haha, we have exposed you evil monsters, our adventurers feel. And with this, the motley crew of adventurers shout, they scream, and they tell the entire organization about these monsters. But surprisingly, others don't find them as scary as they truly are. And if you've been on a design systems journey, you might have felt this before, the realization that you've seen a problem so glaring, so pertinent, and you shout about it, but there is still a lot of convincing you have to do that is a problem worth addressing with everything else that an organization usually has to prioritize. And the battle is harder for these adventurers than they had anticipated, and the beast is stronger than they had ever imagined. The night is darker than it's ever been, and they question themselves, are they strong enough to defeat these monsters? But in their hearts, they know it's a battle worth fighting for, and the victory will be a sweet one. So adventurers don't give up, and they paint a picture of a world without monsters, showing the organization how much better it could be. And these are where the case studies arise, where we bring in the Polaris design systems as examples, and we find numbers to support the fact that design systems can improve operational efficiency and reduce the repetition of things. And happy days, you can paint a clear picture of why it's an endeavor worth pursuing. And seemingly, the darkest of nights comes to an end, and our adventurers see hope. Together, they manage to convince the organization to fight the monster or monsters that they uncovered at the start of their journey. And eventually, the backup arrives, and the backup can be recruited in the form of executives. It can be passionate individual contributors that are suddenly on board and they want to fight these monsters with all their heart. Our crew find their allies, and suddenly there is hope. There's a ray of sunshine in the distance, and what seemed like an insurmountable challenge can actually be solved together as a team. Learning from the past, our crew, along with their allies, set out to equip the whole organization with the weapons they need to fight these systemic monsters, and thus a design system is born. And these tools come in the form of a multitude of things, but you could argue that to a large extent, they are tangible things. In some organizations, this is when Figma comes in. In others, this is when component libraries and pattern libraries are put together and conversations are started with engineers as to how the same can be reflected in code. A happy ending, perhaps, and with great pride, the brave designers share their stories with the world in the form of conferences, blog posts, articles, and the world knows of the battles that came before and the victory and the process with which our adventurers went through to conquer the evil monsters, hoping it will help others to defeat the monsters in their organizations. But the reality is, the monsters still lurk, and they are still lurking in dark corners, just not as prominent. That is, I hope I didn't scare you too much with the thematic story about our design system adventurers. But like all stories, these metaphors ring true to our reality, our past, some of our present, and they tell a cautionary tale for parts of our future. When we take the elements of that story, the different components of that story, and we bring them into reality, the tools, the weapons that our adventurers created, they take the form of a design system and its various resources that are created to support the organization in shipping design and product features. And the allies are contributors, people that in one way or another are adding to design system, either via code or via visual design, experiences, you name it. And the problems identified, where the light was shown, you could argue one of the obvious ones are inconsistencies being addressed, but also the instances here around ways of working, etc. So now that our allies have won the battle against the monsters, but we know that to some extent the monsters are still lurking around, who will keep the tools sharp? And who will rally the allies and keep shining a light on the problems? Well, in some organizations, the response that you get is, well, everybody does. The design system is a shared asset. And if we think about that statement and we convert that into the context of a product organization, and let's say if in the context of a product organization, a board member were to ask an executive, who is responsible for this specific part of the product? And the executive were to reply, well, everybody is. This part of the product is a shared asset. And if you've been in an organization where this has ever happened before, you will know that the reality of something being a shared asset without any given owner is much harder to make any changes or updates than it would be if there was a loose owner or a dedicated owner to that thing. So the heroes that were there at the start of our story today, the ones that fought the initial battles, they can't fight the battles forever. And the reality is systemic problems in the longer term need systemic solutions. I'm going to introduce you to roughly 4 different governance models, and they vary in terms of frequency that you may see in organizations. And my general message today is that everything that I'm about to share with you, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but there is a deliberate answer. And with what I'm sharing with you, it's important for you to, as I go along, think about which ones of these ring true to your organization and the current governance model of your design systems. And for reference, as I'm going along, the field people icons are regular contributors, people that are regularly adding to design system in one way or another. The cube is the design system itself or design system assets, and the outlined person icon are the internal users. In this model here, the overlord model, the contributions to design system, the commits to design system, you could argue are largely made by a single individual or a small group of individuals that are passionate about design systems and the value they can add to the organization. With this model, there are a number of people that use the design system, but a much smaller number that is contributing in a way that's not necessarily centralized, because they could be associated with another product stream or product squad, and they are not necessarily dedicated to working on the design system. This tends to be sort of the path that immediately comes right after our heroes that have helped birth the design system. And these regular contributors actually tend to be the heroes at the start of the story. The challenges with this model is that you could have instances in which there are improvements needed, and there are instances in which other designers are working on features that could improve and upgrade a design system, but there is a bottleneck to actually committing and updating the design system technically from a design perspective. And sometimes that designer could be working on other things, or that group of designers could be working on other things and not have the time or the headspace. And worst case scenario, they could have left the organization, or they might be on a very long holiday. So with the overlord model, it's important to consider whether with the resource that you have, with the people that you have, if it's an appropriate model for you. But the reality is a model like this is very difficult to scale. A centralized model, which some teams of different levels of maturity, you could argue these come potentially at fairly late stages. You may see teams that have dedicated design systems teams. And with this model, you'd have the regular contributors sit at the heart of the design system. They're working regularly with the design system. You could argue that they have few commitments other than the design system. Design system is their main priority. And users of the design system know to go to them or to go through them whenever committing or making any updates to the design system. The advantages of this is that there are clear centralized lines of communication, and people know who is responsible for the design system. But similarly, you still have a single source of failure, and there is some element of a bottleneck depending on how large that centralized team is, how many individuals are per the ratio of other people in other product squads creating features and shipping products at a regular pace. It could still be somewhat of a bottleneck, but it's a feasible alternative to having an overlord, a single designer or small set of designers sitting within product squads looking after the design system. The third model, the federated model, it's somewhat of a hybrid between the first model and another model that you see here shortly. But in this model, instead of having the one design system person that is not necessarily centralized to the design system, you have a multitude of people. And you could think about this model as associating different people with different parts of the design system. You could chop it into different products. You could chop it into different component libraries and assign those different component libraries to different people in the organization in a way that's sustainable and potentially brings the design system closer to the people who are most likely to be creating features within that segment. Naturally, this can be a bit difficult because design systems have shared components that range throughout the entire design system. Things like foundational components like styles, typography, etc. That's quite difficult to chop into different parts. But you could argue that different components or different templates that are largely associated with specific parts of a product can still be associated with specific individuals. And that's the theory, but it's an alternative to the first model that diversifies the risk and spreads the responsibility a bit more throughout the organization. With this model, you could have groups of people that are associated with specific parts of the design system and specific lines of communication that people know who to go to for what part of the design system. And this, again, diversifies the risk and spreads the responsibility. But there could also still be instances where there is still one person responsible for a specific part of a design system. And there's some thinking that needs to be put in place here when you're thinking about how much request, what would be the demand of any given individual within that line for updating and making changes to the design system on top of other work they're doing in their squads. The last model is a more decentralized model that, you know, in the world that we are today with blockchains and cryptocurrencies, I'm sure the concept of decentralization is familiar to many of you. But in this model, you could argue that there is no single or dedicated assigned owner, and the individuals are responsible for their individual parts. And everyone in this specific model would have to have a very clear idea of how to contribute to the design system and to do so in a consistent way with how the product is designed, how the brand is applied. And in this model, everyone would have to have a really strong ability to contribute to the design system without much support. So you could argue that with this model, that you'd have to put in place a lot of strong onboarding at the very start, so that when designers join an organization, they understand that that's part of the responsibility and they feel confident in doing so. We saw earlier examples of playgrounds and instances in which designers could play around and explore, and you might want to explore something like that if this model is most feasible for the scale of the organization and the maturity of your design system and other resources that you have. In general, when we think back to the story at the beginning of today, in keeping the monsters at bay that are still lurking in organizations, beyond the components in your design system, the established styles, the source files, the product screens, think about which responsibilities have you defined for your design system and which governance model is right for you. A number of people, when I talk about design system governance, which I like to talk about a lot, will tell me, well, we've not really necessarily had time to think about that. Well, the reality is, just like UX in its early days, you saying you don't have a UX designer does not mean you don't have a user experience. It's just not very good, and you've not probably thought about it. But you do already, if you have a design system, you have governance in place already. It may just not be the ideal governance for where you are as a business. So it's important to be deliberate about your thinking about what governance is right. And design systems architecture is widespread and fairly well adopted, even though we saw earlier that there are opportunities for people to still be able to confidently structure their design systems more effectively. But personally, I believe it's time that we shift the conversation a bit more to what comes after the hero's journey at the start, the person or the people that help sell the design system to an organization. Thinking more broadly and further ahead, how will we nurture and evolve and reinvent successful design systems, and what models will we put in place to enable us to do so? Thank you, everyone. That's the end of my talk. Happy to take any questions that come through as well.